Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Clément. Monsieur le connétable de Grouville.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Ouen.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Sainte-Marie. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Sauveur.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Southern. Madame le deputy Labby. Monsieur le deputy Thadier.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Luce.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Doublé. Monsieur le deputy Morel. Madame le deputy Lehegara. Monsieur le deputy Ayer. Monsieur le deputy Ward.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Alves. Madame le deputy Gardner. Monsieur le deputy Gorse.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Farnham. Madame le deputy Moore.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Mezek.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Joseph. Monsieur le deputy Balash.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Coles. Madame le deputy Poré.
Pardon.
Monsieur le deputy Ward.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Miles.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Scott.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Renouf.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Curtis.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Feltham.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Binet.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Jeune.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Miller.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Howe.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Binet. Monsieur le deputy Ferry.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Kovac.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Curtis. Madame le deputy Ward.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Wilson.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Stevenson.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Andrews.
Monsieur le doyen.
Notre aide soit au nom de Dieu qui a fait les cieux et la terre. Amen. Seigneur Dieu, Père éternel et tout-puissant, qui a établi le gouvernement et la puissance de la terre pour le règlement et pour la conduite du peuple, et qui nous a commandé d'avoir toujours pour but la gloire de ton saint nom. Nous te prions qu'il te plaise de donner à cette assemblée le don de conseil et de prudence, d'unir les cœurs et les affections de tous ceux qui la composent, de la conduire tellement toi-même par ton Saint-Esprit, que toute leur délibération est accompagnée de ta bénédiction. Réussisse au bien-être et au soulagement du peuple, qu'il te plut de commettre à leurs soins. Car nous t'en prions, au nom et par les mérites de ton Fils, bien-aimé Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur, qui nous a enseigné de t'invoquer en disant: Notre Père, qui es aux cieux, ton nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain quotidien, et nous pardonne nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous envoie point en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal. Car à toi est la règne, la puissance et la gloire, au siècle des siècles. Amen.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Pierre.
Sir, the Connétable of St Peter is travelling to the UK on state's business to visit Medway. May I ask that he be marked as excusé on state's business?
Yes, excused on state's business.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Clément.
Malade.
Vous jurez que Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Clément est tellement indisposé qu'il ne peut pas assister aux États sans exposer sa santé. Monsieur le connétable de Sainte-Marie.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Southern.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Labby.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Doublé.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Morel.
Sir, Deputy Morel sends his apology. He was just caught at late notice, diverted on state's business, and will be in shortly. Please, can he be excused until he arrives?
State's business, yes,
Thank
state's
you.
business.
Monsieur le deputy Ayer. Madame le deputy Alves.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Farnham.
Présent.
Monsieur le Deputy Joseph.
Sir, Deputy Joseph has experienced further issues with his travel arrangements and is still trying to get back to the island. Unfortunately, cannot join the meeting.
He's attempting to get back and he's just excusé.
Monsieur le Deputy Coles.
Présent.
Les États sont constitués. Very well. We continue with the debate on P.31 as amended. The next listed to speak is Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir. And it's nice to restart the debate on a second day of sitting. I don't rise to say much on this debate. I think we've heard many arguments for and against various parts of this proposition. And I thank those who have contributed to the debates. Those who've discussed elements that were part of my amendment, I would have really appreciated if that had been included within those debates as well. But we are where we are. I would like to start, sir, quickly by asking a question about the interpretation of paragraph A that maybe as presiding officer you can confirm.
Yes, just one moment. Graffier, do you have the copy I asked for? I don't have a consolidated version of what has now been agreed, so it may not be necessary, but please do
It may
ask
not
the
be
question.
necessary, so it's purely around part A.
Very well.
Makes it simpler. And my question, sir, is the interpretation of part A a statement of intent akin to an in-principle decision that the states are making, and does it infer any action that will occur immediately on voting on part A? So should the states decide whether they are of the opinion, A, that personal possession, personal cultivation and recreational use should be decriminalised, is there any action that the state or any body will be taking immediately, or is this a statement of intent that until work undertaken by Part B is brought back to the state or to the Attorney General or otherwise, nothing will change tomorrow?
That would be my interpretation of A. A is a statement of policy or intent, but it doesn't mandate any specific action or work in connection with it.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. So really all I have left to say is, having heard the arguments put forward against, to me, many who spoke in favour of B or spoke against A were still of the opinion that, I think as Deputy Reniff described, we have to face reality. We have to address the fact that the current approach to criminalisation of cannabis beyond the guidance currently provided by the Attorney General is the right way forward. So I ask members, before anyone else speaks, and as we get to summing up, to ask themselves if they support B, if they want the government to put in policy time and resource to bring forward the solutions to address a new approach, hopefully, for what members agree, a better approach to substance use, and they want to support Part B, I really want them to ask themselves long and hard what is wrong with supporting Part A as well. We often take this approach. We say, we want an in-principle decision to give the state and the government a mandate to do work so that that work is productive. This state could agree unanimously against the policy decision in principle. But if we did, I don't think any of us should be wanting to ask the government or anybody to perform detailed and long and arguably to a cost, an element of work that the states have already given a decision on. So for that reason, sir, I ask members to consider, do they support the principle? They should not be worried that tomorrow this will make cultivation, possession or recreational use treated any differently by the honorary police, by the parish halls and by the Attorney General than it is today. This is purely a statement of intent to give Part B a mandate. So with that, sir, thank you.
Deputy Scott, you've already spoken in the debate.
Yes, I just wondered if I could just ask a follow-up question of the Solicitor General.
Yes.
Is there any legal definition of recreational, please?
No, there isn't.
Deputy Labby.
Sir, I was going to raise exactly the same point as Deputy Curtis to clarify the in-principle decision. Thank you.
Deputy Jean.
Thank you, sir.
I rise very quickly because I very much support Deputy Curtis and what he's just clarified. And I just wanted to maybe put back into the debate that was had yesterday, because I think it was quite conflated in certain areas, that what this proposal and these A, B and C in the proposition is trying to put forward is trying to make a step towards a more fairer, compassionate approach. And I think that is important to recognise that it's very much complexities in cannabis use, and this seeks to guide rather than to punish. To guide rather than to punish. Because I don't understand why we can make it legal for over 7,000 islanders to access medical cannabis, but others are criminalised. I don't understand how we can do that, and this helps to have that compassionate approach. Because decriminalisation doesn't mean, and it doesn't have to be, a free-for-all. It doesn't mean that everybody will suddenly be on the streets using cannabis. It's about developing clear guidelines that we can establish, that we can understand, and that's where, of course, in B, why Council of Ministers amended it to having all those different points of what could be looked at in relation to B. So I wanted to put that to point across that decriminalisation helps to have a compassionate approach, but it will work best when it's in conjunction with other elements around harm reduction, evidence-based drug dependency treatment services, access to different services that islanders can access without fear of arrest or punishment or stigma or discrimination. And it's important that that comes as a package as a whole, including education and health. And so that's I would like members to think about that as we get closer to the end of the debate, that this is more of a compassionate approach and recognises to guide rather than to punish. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Moore.
So, thank you. I would just like to start by acknowledging the point made by Deputy Jean just then about fairness and compassion. She is, of course, quite right. But one issue that we all need to take into account before voting in this debate, and there have been very many excellent speeches on a number of aspects, but I think a couple of issues have not been raised as yet. And that is our responsibility to the community and how this decision will shape our community if we take this decision and move forward today. We are, of course, in a more liberal society today, and yes, fairness and compassion is quite right, but what we must consider is, if we take this new approach, that there will be an increase in the number of users. At the moment, people who use cannabis do so knowing that they are breaking the law. There is very likely to be an increase of usage if that criminalisation is removed from that decision-making. And we can only look to other places where there have been similar changes to view how that has impacted upon communities. And I can tell the Assembly, I recently spoke to a person who lives in New York, in a smart block of flats in a smart area of New York. They go out onto the street immediately outside their home every day to find early in the morning people smoking cannabis, and that has an impact on people's productivity. I do believe that this government has maintained the economic principle of increasing productivity in the island, and we have to take into account the impact that use of cannabis may have on members of our community and their productivity within our economy and their attitude to work, their engagement in our society. It is an important point to make. Others also in this debate have acknowledged that this is a similar consideration to that which we took in the assisted dying debate. And in that it was acknowledged that we agreed to take the further steps, which will require more work and therefore more cost to our public servants who will have to undertake that work and bring forward the legislation. in the times where we have heard yesterday that difficult decisions are having to be made, money's found to support our health service and our education service, which are our important services, the most important, that need continuing and further investment in society, then we have that responsibility as an assembly to take a balanced decision and consider the impact on our decisions and how that will have an impact and an effect upon the work of our public service and the use and availability of monies that we will have to decide upon in the forthcoming government plan. So, sir, I just wanted to raise those two additional points, which I do not think have been taken into account fully as yet in this debate. It is an important decision. We are a more liberal society today, but we have to be mindful of the consequences of our decisions and whether our society and community can well cope with them, both financially and from a productivity perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? If no other member wishes to speak, then I close the debate and call upon Deputy Coles to respond.
Thank you, sir. I'm afraid I might have fallen foul to Deputy Ward's normal trick of making lots of notes and not being able to read them afterwards. So I'll start with some of the points that have been raised earlier this morning. I am quite surprised by Deputy Moore's comments, as it was her government that brought in the substance use strategy, which focuses on harm reduction, which is the principle of which decriminalisation of end users of drugs actually stems from. So I'm not quite sure then why this wasn't considered before that strategy was published in 2023. So there's been a lot of comments about the effects of cannabis and people who have suffered from mental health problems because of it. And I just would like to say that I'm sorry to everybody who's had to witness this, as I am somebody who's had to witness it as well. There is a lot of talk now within the medical profession that a lot of these conditions are underlying, and cannabis is the spark that lights the fuse that makes the powder explode, unfortunately. But I must remind everybody that cannabis is illegal already and people are using it, and these effects are happening. So I go back in time in my head and think, when and why was cannabis and other substances made illegal in the first place? So we look in the 1920s when America decided to bring prohibition on alcohol. This came at the end of the First World War, where people were turning with these new mental health conditions that people didn't understand. Shell shock. People self-medicated, people drank. The Americans thought this is a problem, we should stop people drinking, so they brought in prohibition. That didn't work. That didn't last. That caused huge problems in racketeering, organised crime, and violence. So they realised that was a bad idea, and they stepped away from it. In the 1930s, then we see cannabis became illegal, and starting the attempts through there. This came after the 1929 Wall Street crash, the Big Great Depression, which caused people again into self-medicating. Desperation ran through the world, ran through the public. People didn't know what to do. People turned to what they could to make themselves feel better in that time. Again, coping with mental health problems. We then look at the United Nations One Narcotic Convention, which came into fact in 1961. This work was started by the then called League of Nations in the 1950s, which again came after the end of the Second World War. Another point where we're seeing great upheaval within our society, people coming back from war, suffering from mental health problems, people turning to substances to self-medicate. Now, I don't blame governments at the time because, like I say, back then we didn't know mental health the way we know mental health now. We didn't know how the brain worked in different ways and how we treated these people. But we know better today. And this is why, after 60 years of trying to incarcerate people and criminalise people for self-medicating with substances, be they legal or illegal, it is time to change the tact on this. And that is why the principle of decriminalisation is an important thing for us to debate. And for me, why it is so important. I look to Deputy War now, because he made a good point in his speech. What legacy do we want to leave as an assembly? We've had a debate on assisted dying, a debate around dignity. I want this to be the assembly that took the hard decisions that reflected on people's dignity. And I think by not criminalising the end users of cannabis is by treating people with more dignity. I say for those who've made comments that they don't necessarily understand the problem quite so much, and they're not sure what to do and how to vote. Now, I'm sure Deputy Southern is going to give me daggers when I say this, but if you're not sure about whether to vote for or against this, well, this is why we have our abstention button. You can vote against, you don't have to vote for Part A, you don't have to vote against it. You can abstain from that vote. Vote for Part B and ask the government to come back with proper ideas, proper decisions, but don't knock down the principle if you feel that you do not understand it well enough. I'd like to thank Deputy Dublé, because she made the best point of this entire speech, in my opinion, in the fact that we have to remember that we have been broadcasted that drugs are bad for 60 years. Every member of here had education telling us the evils and the perils of drugs. But we have learnt more. The world has moved forward. We have to unlearn what we have been broadcasted on for so many years. And I actually think that is that really, really hard thing for us all to do. We've all been brought up with this fixed position that is what we were told, that is what we have to believe. But research changes, methodologies change. Again, if we go back to the post-war, or the First World War, when men were running away on the battlefields, they were shot for cowardice, rather than we actually understand about the fight, flight and freeze response that happens when people go through a mental health crisis. I don't necessarily want to pick apart some people's, but I do have to say that with Deputy Howe's speech and comments, I was there thinking how easy it would be to replace cannabis with alcohol to describe every action that she was talking about. Lowering inhibitions, making unwise decisions. This is all created by something that is legal. I should really also address, obviously, the change again, the why I had to remove the over 18s part from my proposition. And actually, so this isn't about encouraging children and providing cannabis for children. No, of course it isn't. This is about making sure that we can still educate people into the fact that there are effects from drugs, and if you choose to use drugs, they will have implications. And well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of research as well in this debate. And one piece of research that I always found very interesting was a desktop piece done by an American university into the effects on the developing brain of alcohol versus cannabis. The research clearly shows that alcohol has a worse impact on the developing brain from people from the age of 14 to 25 than cannabis. And yet, we do not criminalise children for having alcohol, even though they're not legally allowed to have it. It is just simply removed from them. The person who supplies that child with alcohol is the person who is supposed to be punished under our laws. And there's no reason why any changes in this doesn't mean we couldn't come in with more stricter punishments for those who provide cannabis to minors. In fact, actually, I don't often say this, but the US actually has some very good legislative processes on their punishments. That if you take drink driving, for example, in the US, if you were drunk behind the wheel of a car and you crash into a wall and it's just you in the car, you're treated as a misdemeanor. You have a crash in a car, whether it's into a wall or into somebody else, but if there is a child involved, it becomes a felony. That means the severity of the punishment is increased because not only has your action affected you, but it has affected a child. And actually, maybe that's something we should consider, actually, if there's a punishment for dealing drugs, but there is a harsher punishment for dealing drugs to children. It's just a thought, but more to indicate the fact that I'm not advocating supplying drugs to children. Constable Jean of St John, I am glad to hear that your work is underway for developing a cannabis strategy in regards to the motor traffic law. I know this was said in the previous assembly, but by which point my proposition had already been submitted. But it is good to make sure that cannabis is directed separately within that law, because obviously the effects are different from alcohol and can be different from other drugs, and so we should be considering them in the round and individually as well. But just to make the point on why I've had the proposition mentions a roadside capacity test, I'm quite concerned, sir, that our island when people get to a certain age or a certain condition, they go to see a doctor to gauge whether they still have capacity to drive. So I'm not sure if you were aware, but I was quite staggered when I found out that doctor doesn't actually get into a car with the person who's being claimed whether or not they have capacity. The Constable Lewis is sort of indicated, but for the majority of time, within my experience, the doctor does not get in the car for a very long point to judge whether somebody has capacity. But actually, if the police pull someone over, maybe there is a test that doesn't require electronics, but actually has the ability to gauge whether somebody at that moment had capacity to drive. It doesn't necessarily lead to
I could
anything.
just ask you to pause for a moment. There's two connotables who put their lights on. It may be that it's a point of clarification, or it may be...
Yes.
Thank you, sir. If the deputies please happy to give way just on a point of clarification. In effect, the process is that the individual is referred to the constable by a medical practitioner.
That's not a point of clarification, funnily enough. It has to be a point of clarification of the speech that you have made, or a point of seeking a point of clarification from the deputy. You might wish to couch it, Connitab, in the form of, you have given this indication, can you clarify whether your understanding of the position is A, B and C, which would technically be a point of clarification of the deputy's speech.
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
You can't actually inform people.
Indeed, thank you, sir. I understand. Will the deputy just clarify that his point that the individual is not subjected to a driving test is in fact correct? Thanks.
No, to the Constable of St. Brad, no, I don't believe that the people are subjected to a driving test. As I said, in my experience of it so far has been that the person who has questions over their capacity to drive is referred to a doctor, but that doctor does not get into the car with them until it can get beyond a certain point. Whether that is right, whether that is wrong, but we are testing somebody's capacity at a single point, where actually the police may come across somebody who, at a point, either through the effects of prescription drugs, illicit drugs, general tiredness, may have lost capacity to drive at that point. And maybe there could be some tests that would to gauge that. On the talk of cultivation and the risk of cultivating cannabis at home, the unknowing strength of what people might be growing, I would like to point out to members that homebrew is legal. And for some reason I've got a comment saying Rob Ward and moonshine written down on my pad. And I'm thinking, not insinuating that the good deputy brewed his own moonshine, but actually when we talk about moonshine as an incredibly strong home-brewed alcohol, very famous within the US. But we are allowed to brew our own alcohol at home in front of children. Is that right? Is that something else that maybe we need to look at? I see Deputy Curtis shaking his head, but of course Deputy Curtis is the professional brewer of legal alcohol. Legal moonshine. But there are ways that we can, as it at the moment stands that it is not allowed, that we can bring in guidelines and directives of how we would like that to be controlled. There are ways that we can do that, so I don't necessarily see that is fundamentally a problem. So I'll come back to why I think decriminalisation is the right thing to do. Because, like I said, our government has now its substance use strategy, which focuses on harm reduction. Harm reduction is about treating people with respect and dignity, accepting the fact that people will use substances of all types, and that maybe the substance isn't the problem, but is a symptom of something else. That with decriminalisation, people will be able to seek out support when they need it. And most importantly, it's actually when they want it. Because if we force people into rehabilitation centres and rehab courses and drug awareness courses, they're more likely to fail if somebody hasn't gone willingly, because their mind is not ready to accept the fact that there's a problem. But if you allow it to be a case that it is safe for someone to say, do you know what, I think I have a problem, I think I need help, without the fear of repercussions, without the fear that they may be reported, arrested, and end up with some form of record, be that through a civil sanction at Parish Hall, that will still appear, as I said earlier, on your enhanced DBS check. But this is how people deserve to be treated. This is the modern way of treating substance use. So this is why decriminalisation is something that we should be doing. It brings us in line with our own strategy. As regards to Part B on this, I'm glad that the Council Ministers brought forward the amendment that they did, because I look at how we need to control cannabis, and as I've said, criminalisation hasn't worked for controlling cannabis. Cannabis is still prevalent on our streets, as we say, with 6% of our working population with a prescription. If those regulations change and less people get prescribed cannabis, do we think these people will just stop being cannabis users if they're not wanting to?
Again, I'm terribly sorry. Do you have a point of order or clarification?
A point of clarification, yes. I think the Speaker, in referring
so
to...
is it not normal practice to ask if the Speaker gives way?
Yes, that is true. That was to have been my question. You wish a point of clarification. Deputy Coles, do you give way for a point of clarification? Because you don't... You're at liberty
where
to,
I don't
but
have
you don't
to.
have to.
For the gracious respect of all members, I will, sir.
Your point of clarification then, Deputy.
So, yes, could the Deputy clarify his comments in relation to the substance use strategy and the harm reduction is identified in that use strategy, but not the necessity of decriminalisation in order to treat and reduce the harm that is inflicted upon people who take drugs.
Are you able to provide clarification of that, Deputy? Or?
I don't even know where to begin. So there are many... there's a number of websites that refer on harm reduction and how the strategy works, and that part of that strategy with harm reduction is to remove the fear of reproach. I may leave it up to members what they believe reproach would mean in this context, but for me, reproach means the fear of criminalisation, which I believe to be fair.
Again, Deputy, will you have a point of clarification?
Yes, sir.
Will you give
yes, sir.
Yes.
Could the Deputy clarify if he is referring to the action point on page 38 of that policy that states to continue progression away from criminalisation by reviewing and adopting specific policy options that fall under decriminalisation and legalisation aims?
Yes, sir, I do.
There we are. That answers 2 points of clarification in one fell swoop. Please do continue.
Yes. Thank you, Deputy Doublé.
I beg your pardon, Deputy Scott, do you have a point of clarification?
Could I just clarify that?
Do you give way?
I will just make this note. This is my final time.
Thank you. In terms of the interpretation of giving away, to actually move away from decriminalisation, given the amount of decriminalisation we have, could the Deputy just clarify whether he considers that to be a move away from decriminalisation or towards? In terms of the strategy, how did he interpret it?
Am I allowed to ask for a point of clarification from the Deputy?
No, I'm afraid not. And the point is, it's clearly asking for clarification as to what you understood the strategy to mean in terms of a move for or against decriminalisation. That's my understanding of your question, Deputy Scott.
In terms of that language, thank you.
In terms of that language, it's a matter for you whether you have an answer for that or not entirely.
So my interpretation of decriminalisation means removal of all criminal responsibility for something that is defined within this. At the moment, we have what's considered decriminalisation with civil sanctions. So this is why people are still referred to Parish Hall, where they will still receive a fine and where that fine will appear on an enhanced DBS check. This is obviously still maintains a fear of reproach for their possession. And so my interpretation is that decriminalisation should be what's considered full decriminalisation, as in someone is not even exposed to that level of our judiciary. The police can either remove the cannabis from somebody if they are under the age of 18, and if somebody is over the 18 and the amount is considered to be that of personal possession, an acceptable personal possession, then they would not be dealt with. And that actually links me nicely on to one of the comments made by Deputy Lahagara, the Minister for Home Affairs. She wonders how well-trained officers would be able to determine how much an amount of cannabis is. Members may not be aware, but those that use these substances don't carry around small sets of scales with them to weigh it every single time. Most of them do it by sight. They will gauge, they will see a certain amount of cannabis in front of them. They will determine if they believe that is the right size for the amount that they are seeking to purchase. And I see no reason why very well-trained officers, very capable officers, would not be able to do the same. And if there were any concerns, then that would be up to the officer's discretion still. But like I say, my proposition does not give a prescribed amount of what that cannabis should be. And I would like Home Affairs to consult with the Attorney General and all other stakeholders on this of what they believe would be an acceptable amount for somebody to carry, something that would be easily distinguishable to the officers by their naked eye. So this brings me back onto Part B and the amendment brought by the Council of Ministers. So the Council of Ministers have included the word legalisation. I think this is a very good time to highlight the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. See, decriminalisation, as I've just said, just removes the criminal activity from that level of possession, is what I was seeking. It now would include personal cultivation as well. But you don't necessarily get the right controls that you want to protect people further from cannabis. There's still no regulation over the strength that is on the streets. But I also realise that to go forward with legalisation takes a lot more work, a lot more time, and requires a much larger commitment. I had hoped, sir, that somebody would have brought an amendment to my proposition with the term legalisation in, because that meant we could have had the debate, and we could have expressed that with legalisation can come so much more strong control. You can put so many more restrictions on it by legalising. However, you have to start somewhere. And where legalisation is a form of decriminalisation, it is very worth remembering that decriminalisation does not automatically mean legalisation. So this is why people who are still selling cannabis would still be criminals if they're doing it if they're not a licensed pharmacy or licensed to supply. Sorry, sir. We've gone fans of making my throat a bit.
There is only water in the bottle, is there?
Yes, sir. Maybe tomorrow. So the supply would still be illegal because, like I said, I'm not seeking to encourage more people to use cannabis. Not until this cannabis industry is, if it's for general sale, is better regulated. We need to know the strengths. People need to know the strengths. The fact that there are different strains of cannabis which have different effects on the body and the mind, that people need to know that these different effects, what they are likely to take and how it's going to affect them. These are all very important questions that you can't answer, and still not answering just by keeping it as a criminal offence anyway. So this is why, again, sir, I go back to the treatment of people that are using. So some people, I just think morally it's the right thing to do, and that's what I come down to in myself. Is morally, I don't think it's justified to criminalise somebody who is self-medicating on something that 60 years ago Jersey decided should be illegal now. Because times change, sir. Things move on. So I think I've rambled on for a while now, and I've so many points of clarification. So I will be taking this in part, sir, and I will call for the appel.
When you take it in parts, are you going to take A and then B and C together? Because B or C refers back to B, I think, and it doesn't, therefore, I think it does. Yes, it does. Therefore, it can't stand alone. So it would be
So
A and
then
then
they'll
B
have
and
to
C
take
together.
Part A separately and B and C together.
Thank you very much. The appel is called for. The vote is on Part B. I ask members to return to their seats. Part A, I beg your pardon. Part A. And ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their votes, then I ask the greffier to close the voting.
Sir.
I beg your pardon, Deputy Scott. We're
Sorry,
taking the
I'm
vote.
confused. Why has C got to be combined with B?
Oh, let's deal with this vote first.
Okay, sorry.
That's one. The Part A has been defeated. 22 votes pour, 23 votes contre, 1 abstention. Yes, indeed.
Those members voting for the Connotab of St John and St Mary, and Deputies Southern, Labby, Tadier, Doublé, Morel, Rob Ward, Owls, Gardner, Mesick, Coles, Porre, Miles, Renouf, Feltham, Jearn, Ferry, Kovac, Alex Curtis, Stevenson and Catherine Curtis. Those members voting contre, the Connotab of St Helier, St Lawrence, St Brelard, Trinity, Rouville, St Juan and St Saviour, and Deputies Luce, Lehegara, Ayer, Gorst, Farnham, Moore, Balash, War, Scott, Rose Binet, Miller, Hal, Tom Binet, Barbara Ward, Wilson and Andrews, and the Connotab of St Martin abstained.
The answer to your question, Deputy Scott, is that if you look at C, there is, as should be decriminalised with the provision included in the legislation to be brought forward under paragraph B. Accordingly, if B is not passed, C cannot stand as a single entity.
So then might I say that B nevertheless can be passed, and the question is if it isn't, then C shouldn't be put forward, that it can still be put separately. B still can be put separately, and that surely the position is that if B is not passed,
Well,
then
if B
C
is not passed, C must fall.
Exactly.
If
but
B is passed, you're asking whether that can be taken separately.
yes, please, because my
Well, that's a
intention
matter
was
for
to vote.
the.
Thank you.
I think, as a matter of logic, it can be. So, do you wish to take that separately, depending upon the outcome to
So
be?
I will take your advice and we'll take B and C together.
So, you don't wish to follow the opportunity given by Deputy.
No, sir, because I do believe that this should be included as part of the work the government wished to carry on with, as there is investigation work to come through. So I believe you were correct, and this should be bound together.
Certainly, it's a matter for the proposer of the proposition. B and C will be taken together. The appel is called for. The vote is on the adoption of B and C of the proposition. And I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their vote, then I ask the greffier to close the voting. B and C combined have been adopted. 26 votes pour, 19 votes contre, 1 abstention.
Those members voting for the Connotab of St Martin and St John and St Mary, and Deputies Southern, Labby, Doublé, Morel, Rob Ward, Owls, Gardner, Farnham, Mesick, Coles, Porre, Miles, Renouf, Feltham, Rose Binet, Jearn, Tom Binet, Ferry, Kovac, Alex Curtis, Stevenson, Andrews and Catherine Curtis. Those members voting contre, the Connotab of St Helier, St Lawrence, St Brelard, Trinity, Grouville, St Juan and St Saviour, and Deputies Tadier, Luce, Lehegara, Ayer, Gorst, Moore, Balash, War, Miller, Howell, Barbara Ward and Wilson, and Deputy Scott abstained.
Very well. The next item is transfer of the 2024 departmental underspend into Stabilisation Fund P.35, brought by Deputy Andrews. The main responder will be the Minister for Treasury and Resources, and I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to request the Minister for Treasury and Resources to lodge a proposition to enable the transfer of available departmental underspends identified before the 31st of December 2024 from the Consolidated Fund to the Stabilisation Fund, with the transfer of available funds occurring no later than April 2025.
Deputy.
Thank you, sir. Now, I have been looking at the Fiscal Policy Panel reports, and it's very interesting and enlightening to see that the Stabilisation Fund has remained a contentious issue among consecutive states' assemblies. In the days when Deputy Joseph was Treasury Minister, at one point in time there was over 100 million in the Stabilisation Fund. It was in a better position compared to what it is in now. But of course the financial crisis came along and the government had to respond. The government had to ensure that the government was spending to intervene in the economy. Now, the Stabilisation Fund, it used to really have two purposes. One was a counter-cyclical measure, and the other one was to ensure that public sector deficits were covered. Now, with the latter, that has not really been the case in recent history, and the reason being is because there is nothing in the Stabilisation Fund. Currently, the fund value has less than 1 million left in it. And even looking at the 2014 report, the same issue was occurring. The Fiscal Policy Panel highlighted there was a need to make urgent transfers into the Stabilisation Fund. And here we are, 10 years later, in exactly the same position. Now, it is quite important when we are looking at the Stabilisation Fund that it's an element of fiscal policy for the island, whereby the island has to solely rely upon either government spending or we may have to turn to borrowing. So we don't have the flexibility compared to other jurisdictions. If you look at maybe the Eurozone, they have monetary policy, or if you look at, say, the Bank of England, they will set monetary policy. And so you've got fiscal policy complementing monetary policy. But we do not have that. So, of course, there is a risk that the government may need to turn to borrowing in times where we maybe see a negative output gap within the economy, where the economy contracts, there's less activity, the government is required to step in, maybe unemployment is high, and therefore the government has to intervene. And so it has been a concern of mine, noticing that the Stabilisation Fund is insufficient, and what this means is when we are relying upon drawing down on funds, we either have to turn to the Consolidated Fund, and of course then we could potentially be placing pressure on the fund where we could end up in a fiscal deficit, or, as we have seen with some politicians, they will turn to the Strategic Reserve, which is in a very unhealthy position, forecast at 17% of GVA, when it should be somewhere between 30 to 60% of GVA. At one point in time, the fund stood at about 20% of GVA, so it just goes to show it has actually declined in relative to GVA. And that has partly been down to consecutive state assemblies prioritising growth bids and not making transfers to the reserves, even when we have been in a position where a public sector surplus has been ascertained, where we had the opportunity to ensure that transfers were made both to the Stabilisation Fund and to the Strategic Reserve. So, of course, bearing that in mind, due to there being nothing in the Stabilisation Fund and looking at what's going to happen with the borrowing being agreed upon with the hospital, there will probably be an element of fiscal tightening, despite the fact that Pillar 2 taxation is going to be something that is brought before the Assembly to debate, and of course revenue is most likely to increase. The borrowing itself is going to be long-term, and it's going to be done in tranches, admittedly, but still it means government expenditure is going to increase. So the likelihood that a public sector surplus is going to be maintained is something that I do struggle with, because I think there might only be a small public sector surplus being maintained, and again, that is likely to leave us in a position where we are going to struggle to make transfers into the Stabilisation Fund. So the purpose of my proposition really is this. We need to ensure that the aggregate amount of underspend that is identified on December 31st, 2024, is transferred into the Stabilisation Fund. For far too long, the fund has not received the much-needed transfers it deserves. And I have to say, sir, I do not believe that we should be capping transfers up to 25 million into the Stabilisation Fund. As I have seen, from 2011, there's been 6 years where there has been an underspend in excess of 25 million. Potentially the same could happen again. And we need to ensure we make best use of the aggregate amount of underspend that there is. If it be 33 or 35 million, it all must go into the Stabilisation Fund. And the important thing as well, it's something that we cannot afford to touch. We need to increase the Stabilisation Fund value over the next 3 to 5 years. We have to get ourselves into a position where we were during the days of when Deputy Joseph was the Treasury Minister. Because as Treasury Minister, he anticipated a structural deficit. And what he was doing back then was he was ensuring that there were monies available to address any shortfalls in funding. And for far too long, what we have seen is a culture where growth bids are approved and we tend to forget about the reserve funds. Why? Because politicians are focused on delivering policies all the time, but we have to think about the broader aspect of the public sector and public finances and our future generation. Because if we are not attentive to our reserve funds, then there could be implications for our future generations. We do not want to see them be burdened with debt. That is the most important thing. And even with the hospital borrowing, that itself is going to be a major thing for the island. And of course, fiscally, we will, as a States Assembly, be placed under considerable pressure. Now, it's important that I just touch on one thing here. When I asked a question of the Treasury Minister about the number of growth bids, and this is one of the issues I have in recent history in the States Assembly, she responded to my question about the number of growth bids since 2020, and 276 million has been approved. Okay, and that excludes pay awards and inflation. So we are going down this trajectory. It's the wrong way to go. It really is. Because some of the monies that were approved there, they could have quite easily been utilised, be transferred to the Stabilisation Fund. It would also give us a bit of flexibility. If the economy does contract, then we could have had a sufficient fund there in the Stabilisation Fund where we could have depleted it. And we also have to bear in mind, in depleting the Stabilisation Fund, there must be a culture of replenishing the Stabilisation Fund, not neglecting the Stabilisation Fund. It has happened far too often, and there has not been a commitment to make transfers to the fund. But I also want to just reiterate one point that I've already mentioned in the debate, sir, and that is looking at the amounts of underspends over previous years. On my screen before me, there's been 6 years where I have seen underspends exceed 25 million. However, there are 3 years where I was unable to get the data because it wasn't available to me. So I think that is very important that we do provide the Assembly with a bit more flexibility. We should not be rigid and just say, let's cap the transfer to 25 million. Why are we capping transfers to a fund that is already depleted? Because 25 million itself is not going to be sufficient enough. We need to maximise those transfers, and we need to do it now. So thank you, sir.
Is the proposition seconded?
Yes, sir.
Does any member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as is the case with Deputy Andrews' proposition P.22, I don't intend to criticise Deputy Andrews' intent or purpose, which is well placed. Indeed, the Deputy has proposed something that we already have provision for in the government plan, so there isn't a fundamental disagreement on the issue at hand. But the Assembly has no need to take this decision, and that's why, sir, I do not support it. Part F of the government plan for 2024 to 27, adopted by this Assembly in December 23, enables almost exactly what the Deputy is seeking, so this proposition is unnecessary. That could, of course, be an argument for supporting it. On that basis, one could ask, what harm can this proposition do, given that the Assembly has already agreed to it? But I'm afraid, sir, that I don't believe we should get into the habit of approving what are essentially unnecessary propositions which are more properly covered elsewhere, such as in the government plan. Propositions adopted by this Assembly should be meaningful, I believe, and impactful, and not merely seek further agreement for something which the Assembly has already approved. It goes further than that, sir, because the proposition will impose additional and unnecessary bureaucracy and take up time and resource that we don't need to expend. It would require the Treasury Minister to lodge a proposition and the Assembly to debate that proposition when no such proposition or further debate is necessary. As I've said, this matter has already been covered in the government plan and approved by the Assembly. I note in my comment that we may also need to use any underspends towards meeting the commitment for additional funding to support the agricultural industry, which is also a decision for this Assembly. Once that commitment is met, and it is a competing priority, the immediate focus will be to rebuild the Stabilisation Fund, and that is clearly something that my team are looking at in terms of how we can put additional funding into the Stabilisation Fund. But these are decisions of the Assembly which we respect, and I would also just confirm, for the avoidance of any doubt, that the Treasury team and ministers also pay very close attention to FPP reports. And we do think very carefully about the Stabilisation Fund and all our funds. But I would simply add this, as I've said in scrutiny, and I will say probably countless times from now, we all have our part to play in managing government spend. The Assembly has just supported a proposition which will require some element of cost, while government officials go away and go through the list of asks in the Cannabis proposition. That costs money. Every time we bring a proposition that requires government to do something or to spend money, we are adding to the competing priorities that we all face in terms of putting money into the Stabilisation Fund or the Strategic Reserve or any other purposes that we wish to spend. Sir, no further proposition of the Minister or approval of the Assembly is required to meet the objectives of this proposition. It is therefore unnecessary, and I ask members to reject it on that basis. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? If no other member wishes to speak, Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. I will be very, very short, and I would like to ask the proposer to clarify in his closing speech. We do have two propositions in front of us from Deputy Andrews. One about strategic reserve, which we will debate later, and one about Stabilisation Fund. As we all agreed in December 23, 25 million from underspend would go to Stabilisation Fund. It has been agreed by the Assembly, and we really don't need to debate. Would the proposer explain if he is seeking that any underspend above 25 million would need to be reallocated to the Stabilisation Fund, if this is the intention of the proposition? And if it is an intention of the proposition, why the proposer decided, or was proposing, or think, that any underspend above 25 million after we met all necessary, we will have a deficit in house and we'll need to cover deficit in house, we would have other priorities before we finalize the year. We know what's happening through the proposition. If any more funds remain above 25 million, why they need to go to Stabilisation Fund and not to Strategic Reserve, for example? So I just would like to have these clarifications in his closing speech to make my decision about this proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir. I will keep this brief, and I would like to thank the Treasury Minister for her brief yet very comprehensive answer to this. And I rise purely because we have two debates today from the Deputy on financing matters, which are fairly significant in the latter and already agreed by the states in the former. And this is really an ask for the States Assembly in general. I really like the words meaningful and impactful propositions from the Treasury Minister. The Deputy, like many of us, are incredibly concerned about the island's long-term financing, but I do not believe these propositions are the way we're going to solve this. I think, to quote the Deputy from earlier, such large decisions are usually brought forward by the executive. Well, in this case, they were. And I would really ask for the Deputy, given the collective interest in finances of the public, not to make this a single proposition, a piecemeal approach, to engage as much with states members out of the Assembly. Perhaps we could organise an in-committee debate, although I'll watch perhaps some members shake their head at that, but a really structured in-committee debate on the purpose of funds, the direction we are taking between investing, saving and spending now, I think is a really useful debate and far more useful than what we are debating today.
Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. The Treasury Minister has already explained some very good reasons for why this proposition ought to be rejected by the Assembly, and I wanted to add an extra one into that, and specifically speaking from Reform Jersey's perspective on this. But one reason why this proposition must be opposed is because it risks austerity through the back door. So underspends occur because through the year things didn't exactly go as predicted, and some departments will spend less than they thought they would. At the same time, sir, some departments will spend more than they thought they would. And to determine right from this stage that we will have less flexibility on the reallocation of those funds risks saying to some departments, if you overspend, tough luck, you've got to cut back in other areas. That is absolutely unconscionable. And, sir, if I may say, speaking as the leader of a social democratic party, it's an unconscionable thing to do from a social democratic point of view, where we want decently run public finances that service our public services properly. That means, sir, that we need the flexibility, as described by the Treasury Minister, when it comes towards the end of this year, to manage these spends properly and most effectively on behalf of the public, and not make these sorts of determinations so early on, which could have the unintended consequence of harming our services and delivering austerity through the back door. This Assembly has tried austerity before. It doesn't work, and we should not go back to those days.
Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition? If no other member wishes to speak, then I close the debate and call upon Deputy Andrews to respond.
Thank you, sir. I thank all members who contributed to this debate. I'll just respond to Deputy Gardner's comments when she spoke about why the need to make transfers to the Stabilisation Fund compared to the Strategic Reserve Fund, and why that should be a priority. And the reason being is because there is less than £1 million in the Stabilisation Fund, and due to there being nothing in the Stabilisation Fund, or nothing of any value to really provide any contribution to the economy during a downturn, there is a need to replenish it. And as I said earlier on in my speech, that for far too long the Stabilisation Fund has been neglected, and of course there are competing priorities politically, and I understand with the Council of Ministers often there will be contentious debates about how we are going to be approving funds and how much growth bid, for instance, is going to be approved, and potentially there might even be discussions about cuts being made. But I think it's also important to note as well that the Stabilisation Fund is in a very bad place and it doesn't really have much use. And so we have a Stabilisation Fund that exists, but we cannot utilise it. And therefore we have to go to the Consolidated Fund or potentially the Strategic Reserve in the case where we see a negative output gap within the economy, and the government is going to have to intervene by drawing down funds in other areas, when the whole purpose of the Stabilisation Fund is that we do have funds in it that are specifically used for that purpose. Now, I think it's also important to mention as well that with Deputy Mezek alluding to the word austerity, departments, if they have managed to spend the money they have within their budget and there happens to be a surplus available, then I think it would be prudent that we ensure that underspends are transferred into the Stabilisation Fund, because at least we do have a cushion in the event that the economy contracts. The Stabilisation Fund potentially can be utilised. But I do think it would be maybe premature if we're only maybe looking at 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 calendar years to then be depleting the Stabilisation Fund when, first of all, we need to make sure that we are rebuilding the Stabilisation Fund. And as far as I'm concerned, if we're looking at just setting a cap as to how much can be transferred into the Stabilisation Fund of no more than 25 million, that is totally insufficient in my view. And I think if there are any surplus funds available, then the funds ought to be transferred into the Stabilisation Fund, because we cannot allow the fund to be neglected the way it is. And of course, with our election cycles happening every 4 years, it's often something that tends to be forgotten about. A new Council of Ministers will come into government, they'll have their own priorities, and even if the prior Council of Ministers had a priority of making sure transfers were made to the Stabilisation Fund or the Strategic Reserve, often that will not be the case when the new Council of Ministers takes office, because they have their own policies that they want to deliver. And I understand politically politicians do want to deliver on behalf of the public. However, there is also an important part of being a politician, and that is to ensure that public finances are in a good place. And unfortunately, as we see with both the Strategic Reserve and the Stabilisation Fund, both of them happen to not be in a very good place. And therefore, I think it's a matter of urgency that we do ensure for this year anyway that underspends at an aggregate level are transferred into the Stabilisation Fund to build the fund towards a level where it should be at during the days of when Deputy Joseph was Treasury Minister. So I think I've said what I need to say, sir, and I call for the appel. Thank you.
Well, the appel is called for. I invite members to return to their seats. And I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their vote, I ask the greffier to close the voting. The proposition has been defeated. 1 vote pour, 42 votes contre, no abstentions.
Deputy Andrews voted pour.
Very well. The next item is affordable and right-side housing provision in the Waterfront, P.37, lodged by Deputy Miles. The main responder will be the Minister for Treasury and Resources. Deputy, there's an amendment lodged by the Council of Ministers. Are you accepting that amendment, or?
Yes, I'm accepting the amendment.
Very well. And members agree that we can read the proposition as amended? Yes, very well. I ask the greffier to read the proposition as amended.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to request the Minister for Treasury and Resources as shareholder representative to instruct the States of Jersey Development Company that, in any new proposals or plans for housing developments on the waterfront by the States of Jersey Development Company, A, any such proposals must include a minimum provision of no less than 50% of the homes to be offered with an assisted purchase product for first-time buyers, where the phasing of delivery is agreed by the Minister for Housing and the Regeneration Steering Group, and B, any such proposals must include a minimum of 15% of housing designed to encourage and enable islanders who are looking to right-size, in line with the delivery of the right-sizing policy set out in R85 of 2024, where the phasing of delivery is agreed by the Minister for Housing and the Regeneration Steering Group.
Deputy.
Thank you, sir. So, when we stood for election 2 years ago, members will know that across the island, housing was probably the biggest issue that came up on the doorstep. In St Brelard, young people were telling me that they had little or no hope of buying their first home and were increasingly thinking that their future lay elsewhere. This was of equal concern to parents and grandparents who don't want their families to have to move away from Jersey because it is too expensive to buy a home and raise a family here. We all heard and continue to hear the voices of our parishioners, and we ourselves in this assembly are a mixture of young people, parents and grandparents who are all concerned for the well-being and prosperity of our current and future generations. One way or another, the housing crisis impacts us all. But it's a complex and multifaceted issue. It's largely about the availability of affordable housing, but it's not only about affordability, but about suitability, as this proposition recognises. The question 2 years ago on the doorstep, and the question that remains now, is what are we going to do about it? Over the last 2 years, significant efforts have been made by previous Housing Minister and continued by the present Housing Minister to tackle the challenges that islanders face. Most recently, and probably most encouragingly, has been the First Step Assisted Home Ownership Scheme, which is now bearing fruit, and for which both Deputy Wall and Deputy Mezek deserve credit. As I recognise in my report, at South Hill, ministers and the States of Jersey Development Company have managed to secure 25% of the units for shared equity affordable housing, which again is positive. So it's not all doom and gloom, and I don't want to suggest otherwise. But there is more that we can do, and more we must do, a point which I think is recognised across the Assembly. In 2022, I made a number of manifesto commitments aimed at helping to address the housing crisis. I wasn't alone. Members will have made their own commitments in recognition of the challenge we face, and the new Common Strategic Policy clearly sets out a commitment to building more affordable homes. This proposition, sir, is aimed at furthering those commitments, which I made to the parishioners of St Brelard, and which I hope were part of the reason I was elected. I represent many constituents who purchased their family home through the old States Loan Scheme in the 1970s. Indeed, I am a child of that generation. My parents had a States loan to buy our first home. When I was growing up, I never had to worry that I'd have to leave the island in order to get onto the housing ladder and raise a family. Sadly, this is not the case for our generation, and for the current generation, and I don't want it to be the case for them or for the next. So, since I lodged this proposition, I've been grateful to ministers and officials, other colleagues in the Assembly, residents at the Waterfront, and the wider public for their messages and engagement with me, both where they have agreed and disagreed with me. I'm also grateful to the representatives of the States of Jersey Development Company for their time. I'll touch on that engagement in more detail where it's relevant as I move through the speech. It's important to recognise the role of the Housing Minister. When lodging this proposition, I referenced his previous similar efforts as a backbencher, and I was aware of how he fared in 2021. This time, the Minister, and as far as I can tell the government generally, and the SOJDC have not simply dismissed this proposition or sought to wreck it. They've engaged and tried to find a way to make it work. They've helped me and us to achieve the objective I had in mind, and I'm very grateful for that. I think we've succeeded, and that is why I've accepted the COM amendment. If it's acceptable to the Assembly, this proposition will represent a level of commitment to support first-time buyers with affordable purchases on the waterfront, which has not been made previously. And it introduces, for the first time in that area of town, a commitment to a suitable right-sizing provision to support downsizers or last-time buyers, which is another aspect of our housing needs which we must not ignore. So, in the report accompanying my proposition, I made quite a few comments about the waterfront. I referred to it as one of the greatest disappointments in Jersey's modern history, as it has been so far in the view of many islanders, and the lack of identity, community and place that it suffers. Quite rightly, sir, a number of waterfront residents have contacted me, and I've been delighted to go to the waterfront and meet them in the days leading up to this debate. They have offered balanced and informed insight as to the current state of the waterfront and its future development. Those I met recognise the need for affordable housing. They see the value of right-sizing, but they most certainly do not feel the lack of community which I referenced. It was really encouraging to meet them, and they are rightly proud of where they live. That is why I spoke also in my proposition about opportunity. The waterfront remains a great opportunity for Jersey, and one which can still be a success for islanders. So, the amended provision I've put forward ensures that 50% of the accommodation built in future developments on the waterfront, which could be up to 500 homes, are available to first-time buyers with an assisted purchase product. That might be a shared equity scheme or a deposit support payment scheme. The SOJDC have proven in both respects that they can deliver these in respect of their properties, and I'm confident they can do so again. I recognise that this balance is important. Not every first-time buyer wants or needs a shared equity purchase. Many are already paying very high rents and can afford the mortgage, but saving for a deposit is a frustratingly unattainable challenge. Other young professional first-time buyers may just miss out on the assisted purchase schemes due to their combined level of income, and some will be fortunate enough to be supported by the bank of mum and dad, and it's important that we don't exclude those buyers. In the report to the government amendment, an indication has been given towards a minimum of 15% properties being sold with a shared equity scheme and a minimum of 35% offered with a deposit payment scheme. The Minister and I did discuss putting these figures into the wording of the proposition, but we agreed not to. I think that gives necessary flexibility, firstly, to go further if we can beyond 50%, and secondly, to alter the balance if necessary within that 50%. It might be, at the time homes become available, that the balance of shared equity to deposit support schemes needs to change, depending on market conditions. So this proposition allows for that flexibility, and that will benefit first-time buyers with their needs at the time. So the aspect of this proposition which is different to past versions on this subject is the addition of a right-sizing provision. It's a subject I feel quite strongly about, and again it's something I heard regularly from the public during the election. I recognise, though, that in some quarters it has raised eyebrows, and others have been sceptical as to the actual appetite for it. I've been told that the Waterfront is the wrong place for downsizing or right-sizing, and that nobody will want to move there. Well, that certainly wasn't the view of the residents I met, who themselves had downsized to the Waterfront from a large property in St Clement. They love the location. They no longer need to use the car. They said it was the best decision they'd made. They told me everything is close by, including doctors, dentists, the hospital, food shops, coffee shops, and town. The marina gardens are a hive of activity, children playing, dogs being walked, fitness classes for all types being conducted. There's no shortage of activity here. The gardens are incredibly well maintained, thanks to JDC's contract gardeners. We hardly ever need to drive anywhere. In my block alone, we now have a number of people that get around on mobility scooters. It's that easy to get around. And it was the loss of mobility that was one of our considerations when we decided to move here. And he made it clear that he wasn't alone either. I've also been told that people will want to stay close to their existing home or in the parish in which they live. I can completely understand that, but we mustn't forget that 1/3 of the island lives in St Helier. So I'm sure that there will be people in St Helier who would be happy to voluntarily downsize to another part of their own parish. The evidence from past schemes in other parishes is clear. Downsizing villages, if designed well, are always overwhelmingly popular, and that is the challenge we need to meet. I cited several examples in the report, but they bear repeating. Hameau de la Mer in St Clement, L'Hermitage in St Peter, Table Park in St Brelard, Langtree Gardens in St Saviour. The proposal for a 15% downsize provision, probably between 100 to 150 homes, is consistent with the recently published right-sizing policy. Indeed, I waited for this policy to be published before lodging this proposition. It specifically references SOJDC's future housing developments and the need to encourage suitable right-sizing packages. With plans back at the drawing board stage, there is ample opportunity to create a right-sizing provision on the waterfront that is attractive and highly sought over, with the appropriate density and square footage adding to the vibrancy and community of the area, which we're all seeking to further encourage. So before I move the proposition, I want to say a few words on the public realm aspect of the waterfront. In my proposition, I emphasise the need to put our housing needs first, and I don't recoil from that. However, I think the narrative around public realm is misplaced. Of course we need to continually invest in our public realm, and we need housing schemes which create attractive communities, and that in turn needs public realm investment. But there needs to be clarity in the plans about what is meant by public realm. Is it parks, pools and gardens, or is it actually shoreline management, flood defences and basic standard infrastructure? Following my engagement over the past few weeks, including with the Minister, we have a proposition which can deliver the assisted purchase schemes for housing on the waterfront and maintain the public realm investment that forms part of that development. So to close, sir, I ask members to give hope to islanders of all ages and to show that as their representatives, we can both talk the talk and walk the walk in addressing their housing needs and the housing crisis. There is no bigger challenge than housing our islanders, and this site represents our opportunity to send a positive message and give hope to islanders. So I move the proposition and I look forward to the debate.
Is the proposition seconded? Does any member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'm grateful to Deputy Miles for accepting the Council of Ministers' amendment. Sorry, I should say I rise to speak as the named Minister in the proposition. I share the Deputy's desire for SOJDC to contribute to the construction of a range of housing that will meet the aspirations of all islanders. I do not believe, however, that SOJDC should simply build apartment blocks with no associated public realm and infrastructure, as I think the Deputy now accepts. To do so would infringe on their whole reason for being. P.73 of 2010 makes it clear that SOJDC are not simply house builders, but developers with a strong emphasis on regeneration. It is for that reason that the Ministerial Oversight Group that gives direction to SOJDC is named the Regeneration Steering Group. This Assembly, in previous debates, has recognised that ultimately development of the waterfront has to be commercially viable. It should have a mix of housing types, including providing islanders with opportunities to get on the housing ladder and have a significant investment in infrastructure and public realm. That requires a delicate and difficult balancing act to ensure that all of these requirements can be met. The overall objective is not simply to construct X number of additional housing units, but to construct a development on the waterfront that is a quality destination, that is not divorced from the town centre, that has public realm of which we can all be proud, and that also happens to have housing within it. This amendment from COM seeks to balance all these requirements, to give SOJDC a sufficient steer, and to give members confidence that the Regeneration Steering Group can be trusted to provide oversight of these activities and the plans of SOJDC. Sir, I urge members to approve the proposition as amended and support SOJDC to ultimately deliver a waterfront that aligns with community expectations and one which we will all want to visit. Thank you, sir.
Very much. Minister. Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. And I just make one little observation. I notice he's not in the Assembly room at this moment in time, but I'd be very interested to hear the views of Constable Crowcroft to this proposition. I hope he hasn't been gagged to talk. I thank Deputy Miles for her proposition and its intent to do good for the people of the island. We've seen the success of the First Step scheme that my housing team developed in 2023 and which is being successfully delivered in 2024.
Deputy Ward, on reflection, I'm not sure you can suggest that a member has been gagged.
Oh, I apologise, sir. Okay.
The Assembly, that seems to me to be potentially offensive both to the member it is suggested has been gagged and the suggestion that other members may either collectively or individually have sought to gag them. I realise you didn't point the finger at anyone in the latter category, but it seems to me for both reasons that's not parliamentary. So would you please withdraw it?
I apologise for that commentary, sir. I shall carry on, sir.
Yes.
The scheme clearly demonstrates that for a good number of islanders, the only way they will get to own a home of their own is with some form of assistance. In many cases, that will be with help from the bank of mum and dad, as highlighted by Deputy Miles. But for those less fortunate, schemes such as Andium Home Buy and First Steps help facilitate that first milestone. I would remind members that the requirement to deliver affordable homes is actually baked into the Bridging Island Plan through policies H5 and H6, which determine that developments of 50 homes or more have to offer a minimum of 15% as affordable. The Bridging Island Plan also proposes that 460 homes are built on rezoned fields made up of 373 affordable homes and 87 for supported living. On top of that, we also have the Constable-Jackson Amendment to the Bridging Island Plan around housing mix. This was passed by the Assembly and makes sure that all rezoned developments have a proportion of smaller homes to enable right sizing. There is a lot of policy in place that looks to deliver both affordable homes and right sizing options. It begs the question on what evidence has the 50% and 15% affordable/right sizes homes in the proposition been arrived at? And I hope in her response, Deputy Miles will be able to address that question. It's a really important question, and I point members to the economic impact statement in the amended proposition from the Economics Unit. It states, in general, competitive markets deliver the best outcomes. Anything that prevents a market from fully functioning, e.g. through the creation of submarkets and artificial divisions, reduces competition and risks suboptimal outcomes. This proposition creates artificial divisions by designating a proportion of the development for two different types of buyers. Sometimes to correct a market failure, such interventions can be optimal, but it is not clear that there is a market failure affecting first-time buyers or right-sizers. The report goes on to say this proposition is likely to affect prices and or the profitability of the development. It might lead to an excess supply of first-time buyer flats and of flats for right-sizers and push up the prices of flats on the open market. In extremis, it could make the development uneconomic. These are the unintended consequences when governments make significant interventions in the housing market. In my speech to the Assembly earlier this year, I spoke to the need to make a holistic approach to housing, the need for a long-term vision rather than constant short-term tinkering. As part of that thinking, I wanted to get a project going around housing data intelligence. And if I were the housing minister, this project would be well underway. We need data to make sure these types of decisions, we use data to make these types of decisions, not dogma. We urgently need a serious long-term housing strategy that is sustainable and helps us make better policy choices to manage what is ultimately a complex market issue. I'd be interested to hear from the Housing Minister as to where he is on that journey. Next, I want to turn to some of the commentary within the proposition that repeats many of the old tropes that dog both the SOJDC and the Waterfront, and I appreciate that the Deputy has addressed some of these points. She states in her proposition, whilst the overall waterfront development has been one of the greatest disappointments in Jersey's modern history, we have a chance to write a new chapter of which we can so be proud. Currently, the waterfront still lacks a sense of place, community and vibrancy, and I do appreciate that the Deputy has addressed that commentary. And so therefore, I'm not going to repeat a number of the points made by, I understand, the resident who she spoke to, the residents she spoke to. The commentary I would like to just pull forward, though, is we are building a sense of community through the Waterfront Residents Association meeting. I have met so many people living at Castle Quay and Horizon by simply walking around Marina Gardens, stopping for a chat. The people best placed to comment on the vibrancy of the waterfront are those of us that live here. I've yet to hear anyone that lives here saying that they don't enjoy the place. Most of those that criticise the waterfront and the apartments don't live here and have no first-hand experience to back up their comments. I would add that the Residents' Association has not only managed to get the underpass reopened, but has also pushed for an update of street lighting and road crossings. The residents really care about their environment, and because of that engagement, it is probably one of the most progressive parts of St Helier. I'll finish this section on my speech with a final testimonial from a Miss L. I love living at Horizon. It's a joy to come home and see my neighbours, and see my neighbours feel the same. The great glazing gives me amazing views over the waterfront gardens and loads of natural light, making me feel like I'm on holiday every day. It's a really wonderful place to live and to be able to walk around and be so close to town. And I have to say that's such a refreshing contrast to the commentary peddled in 2023 by the current Housing Minister and his fellow Deputy Tadia. I want to turn briefly to the functioning of and perceptions around the SOGDC. I quote from the government's response, and I'm interested to see the Treasury Minister's commentary. Deputy Miles states elsewhere in her report that infrastructure and public realm improvements are the duty for government to fund anyway. This is not true. There is a long history of developers, both public and private, providing infrastructure and public realm as part of new large-scale developments. Once again, myth meets facts. The myth that SOJDC is not responsible for delivering public realm, that they don't need to make a profit because others are responsible for public realm. The facts are that SOJDC only received £40 million of assets when it was set up. That contrasts with the £678 million transfer that was made to Andium on inception. The SOJDC, as it says on their website, is the Government of Jersey's partner for regeneration and strategic property development. It was never intended to be a social housing provider. In that respect, it's done a pretty good job. With that small asset base, SOJDC have generated cumulative returns of £52.3 million from their £40 million asset base since 2012, and on average have made an annual return of 12.3%, comprising of £10.8 million in dividends, £3.3 million invested in public infrastructure, and £3.2 million invested in community projects, and £35 million invested in future development projects. No one is more aware of the benefits SOGC bring to this island than the Constable of St Helier. And I will refrain from my next sentence because I'm repeating my initial commentary. And I hope he gets the opportunity to speak in this debate. I'm sure he's furious at the thought of a major development taking place on the waterfront that brings no benefit or could bring no benefit to the rest of St Helier. This brings me on to the final part of this speech, and it's a subject that is close to the heart of the Constable of St Helier, that of what he so eloquently called back in June 2017, town cramming. Edinburgh House, Cyril Marcon Court, the Northern Quarter, the Limes, the Mayfair, and finally the Ann Street Brewery site have combined created hundreds of new homes in St Helier, thanks to the decision of this Assembly to densify town so that our countryside can remain green. That decision on paper made sense, however, as time has gone on, and it's particularly noticeable at the After Power Improvement Group meetings, there's a sense of enough is enough. It's time other parts of the island took on their share of the housing burden. Did Deputy Miles talk to the Constable about her vision of the waterfront before bringing forward her proposition? Again, I look forward to hearing her response. All the supplementary planning guidance for the rezoned greenfield sites are in place. That's well ahead of anything that's going to be delivered on the waterfront, and existing policy meets with the requests made by Deputy Miles. I also remind her that we have 900 vacant homes scattered throughout the island that probably don't require much planning permission either. If she worked with the constables and could persuade the current housing minister to reactivate the policy that's in round numbers 1,360 homes without even touching the waterfront. Finally, members should read the reasons for the amendment really carefully. In an effort to meet Deputy Miles' 50%, a split has been offered of 15% shared equity and 35% homes provided with an SOJDC deposit payment scheme. This is very different to a deposit loan scheme. Whilst the 15% is simply in line with policy H6, the 35% element has little to do with reducing the headline price of a home. It simply encourages people to save up their deposit whilst their home is being built. This is very much the same scheme as was used on the Horizon development. I don't see how that meets the affordable home requirement of Deputy Miles' original proposition. Trying to save whilst also paying rent doesn't sound that helpful, and probably wrecks the Deputy's original intent. maybe this is a new definition of affordability that I've missed. I will support the amendment as it minimises the risk of the future viability of SHADC. I would, though, remind those members with rezoned sites in their parishes to get on and develop them if they truly want to see an end to the housing crisis.
Over to Tadye.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad that we've heard from a former housing minister. I'm sure we're going to hear from the current housing minister in a moment. I think this proposition today and the amendments that we've got are very exciting, and I commend Deputy Miles for bringing this, and I'm very happy to support my St Brelard colleague in this as well. The first thing I want to say is that she is correct in the sense that many people of my parents' generation did also benefit from the state's loan scheme. And it's one that really made a difference between having, what shall we say, an experience in Jersey which would have been the other side of the margin. Because what I do want to say is that a lot of people in my parents' generation, when we were growing up, life was still marginal. And it wasn't always easy to know where the money was going to come from for all the expenses that you have with 4 children, and to maintain your house and to pay off your loan. But the security that you had of knowing that you had a secure home that you could come back to, you weren't going to get evicted from it, that you could invest in, and that by the time that you retired, and I remember my dad timed it right so that when he retired, he'd paid off the house. After that, it was a great relief for him and for the family. So I think it is important that we don't buy into this doctrine, because the former speaker did talk about dogma, and there has been a rising dogma that the states and the government shouldn't get involved in the market at all. But I think the older generation in Jersey know that there is a place for state intervention when it's got a clear intent, and when it's designed to help people who are working hard in the island to make their life more manageable. And I think this is where I slightly disagree in terms of maybe it's putting the cart before the horse, because the former approach, the approach from the former housing minister is one that we shouldn't really form a vision, if I understood correctly, until we've got all the data. So we can get bogged down with data, of course, and you can just spend 2, 4, probably 10 years collecting data, and you won't have enough data to decide what you want to do with that. And of course, the data, statistics can, as we know, can prove different things for different people. I think what's fundamental is that we have a clear vision. Hopefully the government has a clear vision, but the States Assembly also, about, even if it's a high-level one, about what kind of Jersey they want to see and what kind of housing situation they want to see for people who live in Jersey. And it might be just something as high level as saying that actually we want to make sure that at the end of the day, people, whether they're renting or buying, don't have to use such a high proportion of their earned income, so that when they are left with their money, their disposable income, they don't really have enough to pay bills, to pay for the food, and to pay potentially for their children's school uniforms. And that, unfortunately, is something that we're seeing more increasingly in Jersey, despite the fact that, in the same breath, we often say that Jersey is an affluent society and that we are very lucky to be living here. The second point is that I'm really pleased that Deputy Miles has highlighted an issue which does come up very often, and it came up in one of my surgeries only a couple of months ago, when a lady from, again, a well-established family of my parents' generation and the children of my generation, she said, we've got a 3-bedroom house in one of the estates in St Brelard, in the top part of St Brelard, of course, because that's where the estates are, generally. And she said, we just want to move out. We'd like to sell that. I would like to have, to downsize, and I'm actually quite happy just to rent somewhere. And it would be great if there were some schemes around, but it isn't worth me selling my 3-bedroom house, which the children have now left. I'm there with my partner, because there's nowhere for me to go. And others would like to buy, and of course they're looking around. Why on earth would you sell a 3 or 3.5 bedroom house wherever in the island to downsize to potentially a 2-bedroom apartment, which is more expensive and doesn't have the outdoor space or doesn't have the storage space for some of the things that you've accumulated perhaps over 70 years of living in Jersey? And so I think this does very much seek to tackle that issue. And of course, it's always going to be possible for people to pick holes and say, well, why exactly these percentages? I'm sure the Deputy will give us some reasons for that, but I think you've got to start somewhere, haven't you? And you've got to decide what's reasonable and what the balance should be. I'm also really excited to know that the Housing Minister, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but it's something that I was also looking at, is that we know that in other places, for example in Wales, there's a scheme that already exists called Rent to Own. So there are slightly different variations of this all around the world, but in this particular scenario, you rent a property, you pay the going rate for up to 5 years, and then after 2 years, you've got the option to buy the property, and then or buy the home, if we're going to appeal to Deputy Ward. And you decide, and when you do decide to buy it, you get 25% back of the rent that you've accumulated over that period, and any uplift in the property value, you'd also get 50% of that since the time you've moved in. And I think these kind of schemes are really, in some ways they're really logical and they're fairly obvious, but it's eluded governments up until this point to do that, because I think we haven't had a government that really wants to intervene in a meaningful but measured way in the market, to accept that the market can't do everything because the market doesn't, produce fair outcomes. It's not designed to do that. It's not conscious. And that we do try out these schemes which ultimately will be helping people living in our communities. And of course, the 50% affordable homes, I think, is also very, very laudable. I'm going to leave my comments there because I'm not the Housing Minister, but I'm reassured, and I'm not just saying this as a party member, I'm reassured that this government, I think, is taking housing matters from a more pragmatic stance. I don't think they're being ideological about it. I think that they're saying we've got a broad coalition in the Council of Ministers, but we all have concerns about the needs of islanders. And here we've got a very good example of now a backbencher who's seen the ministerial side bringing forward constructive proposals that I think we should all be getting behind and supporting the Housing Minister and the rest of the Council of Ministers to deliver this constructively.
Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. So I applaud Deputy Miles for honouring a commitment at the election, and I'm pleased to hear of the positive feedback she's had in her dealings with the Council of Ministers. I'm just going to ask if she might address some matters in her summing up speech, which I think will be of interest to the constituents of the constituency that we both represent, because I likewise had received feedback from constituents regarding concerns regarding right sizing, and I have a slight concern. Whilst I think this proposition has lots of positives about it, I have a slight concern that it may not address some of the concerns, and in fact that were raised in my constituency, and might have consequences for it if certain things aren't addressed. And in that respect, I acknowledge what has been said by Deputy War regarding data and the tendency to be town-centric and trying to avoid cramming in town. It is important that young people have places to buy, but my particular focus has been on the people who are looking to sell in St Brelard. And not just to sell, but to continue living in St Brelard. And we don't really have a housing policy that, as far as I can see, enables that. So what we have now is something on the table saying, well, okay, you can move from St Brelard and right-size, downsize into St Helier, and that might not be what people want to do. So it may not be enough to free certain houses. And indeed, when it comes to buying property in St Brelard's, many people will say you don't buy a house in St Brelard's if it's over a certain age. You buy a project. Most of them need to be modernised. There's a whole expense of that. And many people won't sell and modernise first because they don't even know what the buyer will want. So we've got a bit of a kind of Mexican standoff going on in St Brelard. And the concern is that even if we have some success in moving people from St Brelard into town, then what happens to the properties that are freed up? Will they necessarily be converted into smaller units to enable right-sizing? Or will, because that often is more profitable for developers, will they be developed as a luxury mansion that can be sold off? And therefore that doesn't perhaps achieve the objective. So there are... I'm interested, again, when we talk about these percentages, even to understand what are the numbers in St Brelard's of people who are looking to downsize in our parish? Does the deputy know? Does she have any proposals in terms of finding out? Because I personally would be interested in knowing. I think that it is something that the deputies need to explore, and the constable too. In this respect, I think I should acknowledge the work that the constable has done already in introducing and working on the concept of right-sizing. There is some a policy in the island plan, but what's in the island plan isn't enough in terms of delivery. It's just principles. So how does the deputy propose to follow up to address these particular areas of concern and perhaps help in delivering? And of course, I'm sure all the parish representatives would be interested in participating in any project she proposes in that respect. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir. I don't have a huge amount to add to this proposition, but I do want to reflect on what I think Deputy Miles and the proposition is asking the Assembly's approval for. It refers to right-sizing and it refers to the affordable assisted purchase products for first-time buyers. But it's one of suitability and one of producing the right housing that Jersey needs right now. I should say, firstly, I've always struggled with zoning of affordable housing. To me, promoting the use of assisted purchase products and shared equity too much is only postponing the eventual day we have to address that the open market cost of housing is too high, and that government should be looking at the tools needed to intervene there. But moving beyond that, this is about what is suitable, what is attractive for Jersey residents, whether first-time buyers or right-sizers. And in the report, Deputy Miles references estates such as Hameau de la Mer, L'Hermitage Gardens and Tabor Park, and says the waterfront development presents an opportunity for providing this type of accommodation. Members may want some context on these developments. These developments have open circulation spaces outside, they have good quality private amenity space and plenty of access to natural light. In fact, on my first day knocking on doors for the election, I timidly knocked around Hameau de la Mer as my first location, and I was welcomed in to a ground floor 2-bedroom unit. And the person who moved in right-sized into that unit. They had had a good few years there already, and they were ready to make their final move to a 1-bed. And they said, I can't. And I said, well, why won't you move? And they said, there is no housing, which is 1-bedroom, right-sizing, that provides what I have here. I have south-facing light, I am on the ground floor, and I have a terrace/small garden outside. And I thought, you're right, no money in the world, no convenience of one fewer bedroom to tidy will give that quality of life. And so I want to kind of preempt any discussion about density and the density of development. It is true that the Waterfront is a site in St Helier, and that under St Helier character appraisal, The new waterfront location is the only region as having a low sensitivity to higher development. But there is no point delivering higher density development if it's not attractive to anyone. To reference a previous scheme, members will know what the previous scheme looked like. There was a huge debate about the density of that site, but the inspector agreed the most relevant number to use was that provided by the planning authority as having a density of housing of 185 dwellings per hectare. And the Minister for Environment published new density standards in 2023, which detailed minimum density standards. For smaller settlements, that's 30 dwellings per hectare. Local centres, 35 dwellings per hectare. Lekennevay, 40 dwellings per hectare. And the town of St Helier, 50 dwellings per hectare.
So I was very pleased that Deputy Miles very quickly made reference to the right-sizing policy in her proposition and did so in very quick order. The right-sizing policy referred to work with the SOJDC to ensure that they are developing homes which can be desirable for those who want to move out of a larger home into a smaller one. And I'd be clear about that that's for those who want to do that. It's not about penalising those who haven't made that choice. It's about enabling those who do want to do that. And we've already had discussions with the SOJDC about what kind of products and incentive mechanisms can be utilised in that to help people who otherwise might not feel it was a viable option for them. So there's some really good work on this that's already underway. And this proposition provides a good opportunity now for the Assembly to set a clear signal of intent as different to that which existed previously, and send out that message that we are taking a new approach on this, and we are trying to give hope back to those people who, until this point, you can't blame for having not felt much of it. So Sarah, I'm very pleased to support this proposition, pleased to support the amendment. I thank Deputy Miles for bringing it, and after many years of feeling like I've been banging my head on a brick wall on this subject, that bruise on my forehead is getting lighter now, so I thank the Deputy for helping us get to this point.
Very much, Deputy. Deputy Renouf.
Thank you, sir. I want to make a speech which is on the theme of stories, although Deputy Mesick has, to some extent, slightly stolen my thunder. It's a 2-year anniversary, and for people who've been in the Assembly, that obviously, for a while, that obviously won't count for much, but for me, that's halfway through my first term. And so I have been taking stock. And my son helped me with this recently, and with apologies to people who've heard this before, I'll just tell this little story. He told me recently that I was quite well known in his year group at school. He's in year 10. And I thought this sounded promising, and so I asked him why I was well known, thinking that perhaps it might be to do with something I'd done in the Assembly or maybe even my previous career. And he didn't even look up from what he was doing, and he just said, "Big forehead." That's what I'm known for in his year 10. I thought that helped put things into some perspective. Hopefully when they come to vote in a couple of years' time, if I'm standing then, they may remember me for something else. So I've learned a lot in the last 2 years in this Assembly. And one of the things I've learned, it's a slight irony really, is that stories matter in politics. It's an irony because my previous job hammered home that stories are the way we communicate as human beings, and it is the most powerful form of communication. And it is also, of course, true in politics. But I know that I always have a temptation to default into the detail, to the policy substance, to the kind of the technicalities. And actually, often it's not about that. It's about the bigger picture, the story. And people who get stories right in politics may have a big impact. Obama had a story about America. Nigel Farage has a story about the UK. Whatever you may think of it, it's a story, and it has impact. And I think the waterfront is often approached, has been approached, as a technical issue. For example, we've had to judge it against planning policies. I had to do that last year with a small panel. Had to judge the planning application. And of course, that was a technical exercise in judging against a very detailed set of policies and a complex judgment. And the decision we made was controversial. I got a lot of feedback backing that decision, but of course, there were some who were opposed. I would say the one thing absolutely nobody said was, what a shame we lost such a brilliant scheme. Nobody said that. I may get some feedback to that effect now, but nobody said, oh my word, you've turned down the most amazing scheme. And I think that's quite telling in terms of the way that the waterfront has been perceived. So that's one way we see the waterfront, through the lens of planning. We also see it through the lens of the government organisations, the SOJDC, and commercial factors, the details of whether a scheme is commercially viable, the compromises that have to be made to achieve viability, and that's why we end up with a scheme that is focused on maximising revenue in terms of the housing development in order to fund public realm. Or we get tied up in the complexity of, as Deputy Scott said, why 50% and 15%? What are the figures? Why are we, why have we chosen those figures? It's all in the detail, and I think that's missing the big picture. It's missing the big point, which is that we've had a lack of a compelling story about the waterfront from politicians and from the JDC. I think I will say that Reform Jersey perhaps deserves some credit. They have attempted to tell a consistent story about that site. This is the story, I think, that most islanders believe about the waterfront. I think the people see the waterfront as a story of shattered dreams and broken promises. It does not feel like it has delivered on what was offered, what was promised. And that's not to say that there aren't good points about the waterfront today, as we've heard in the speeches. Of course there are. It is perfectly possible to have residents who are happy with their homes and have a wider dissatisfaction with the way the development has developed, and indeed from points of view like the aesthetic point of view, because aesthetics do matter. The waterfront is not a beautiful place. I accept that many people enjoy living there. It has good points. It is not a total mess, but it is not an inspirational site when you approach it from most angles. And I agree with the current Environment Minister very much that aesthetics matter. The fundamental point, I think, is that the waterfront is ours. It is not private property. It is owned, indeed created, by the people of Jersey through their taxes. And therefore, it is not surprising that people feel invested in the future of the waterfront. We are all literally invested in it. I still get told by people how the idea was originally sold. The idea for reclamation on the waterfront was originally sold as a wide open space, a public park or something similar. So it's against that background that we come to this proposition. I would say that Deputy Miles' proposition does not solve every problem. But we are sometimes bedeviled by the picking apart of things rather than the let's build on this. It is not a proposition to solve every problem, but that is not a reason to vote against this proposition. The story we need to tell about the waterfront from now on is that the prime consideration above all others is that it should work for the island. It has to visibly work for islanders. And of course you can interpret that in many ways, but I interpret it this way. It has to clearly and obviously make a significant contribution to the problems that islanders are facing. And I think this proposition makes that leap. I hope that the SOJDC and the government can use this opportunity to create an inspiring story. And I think we've heard good words from the Housing Minister about his intentions in that regard. It is right for the government to intervene. It is a government asset. For islanders, the details of the schemes don't matter that much. Yeah, there are problems with assisted purchase. There are always risks. There are risks in everything. But islanders want us to transmit on a wavelength that says, we recognise the issues you face. We hear you. And we're using one of the levers we have to make a stab at dealing with those issues. The details are for the civil servants and for the JDC and for politicians to deal with. They want us to just show that we understand and we're doing something. I committed in my manifesto to significantly increasing the proportion of affordable homes in government-owned property developments. So I will wholeheartedly support this proposition, this amended proposition. Let's start to tell a new story about the waterfront. I hope the government and the SOJDC rise to that challenge. The proposition opens up a new big opportunity, a beginning, not an end. Let's start off on that road. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition? Deputy Andrews.
Thank you very much, sir. I must start by commending Deputy Miles for doing her job as a backbencher and holding the executive to account by bringing forward her proposal. That may have otherwise not been brought forward by the executive this term. I think it's essential that this States Assembly is supporting people and individuals who have aspirations to enter home ownership, because as we all are very much aware, it's very difficult in Jersey accessing home ownership, especially when credit lenders have robust criteria, 5 times your income. And if you don't match that criteria, then again, it's very unlikely that you will be able to access any borrowing, and you'll probably just live a life as a perpetual renter. And of course, rents in Jersey happen to be very expensive in some cases because the market is so distorted, and that's really prohibiting many households from having the ability to save up for a deposit, and then to also match the lending criteria, the criteria that credit lenders have in place. And I just would like to go on further about just one concern that I do have, and I think I just probably want one of the ministers maybe just to speak on this, and it's just about the viability of the development, because I know the last time the waterfront development was proposed, there was 15%, 30% and 50% affordable housing on the development, and I know with 50% affordable housing, and this was again in relation to 1,000 units, there was going to be a loss of £44.4 million. Now again, it's quite difficult to know what the scale of the development will be, and I was just wondering whether consideration has been given as to how much the shared equity loans will be, and also as well, you know, speaking to the Jersey Development Company, what is their relationship like with credit lenders on the island? Because I think it's important that if we are agreeing to something, we do need to ensure that the project is going to be economically viable. As much as we want to be helping first-time buyers, I think the scale of that assistance has to be recognised, because what we cannot afford to do is to see no profit, for instance, be made on the development, and a credit lender may turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, but we are not willing to lend any monies to the Jersey Development Company. I think there potentially could be a risk that may happen, especially if we are looking at such a scale of support on the development being 50%, whereas say if it's maybe 15, 30%, we would probably see that there would be margins in order to then go ahead with the development. So I would just like to seek maybe clarity potentially from the Assistant Treasury Minister, because I know the Treasury Minister has already spoken about that. So that's all I need to say, sir.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Jean.
Thank you, sir. I was thinking of what else to add to this debate, and I just thought I'd add maybe something that Deputy Reniff was talking about when he was talking about stories. And I just wanted to pull everybody's memories back to the time before when we started talking about what the waterfront should be. I was quite young then, but my mum was actually on the kind of committee, I don't know what they called it, but kind of like a citizens committee that was pulled together to really think about what we would want from the waterfront. I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and I remember her coming back from these meetings and over the dinner table, being very frustrated about the discussions, or animated, I should say, about the discussions about what we could have on the waterfront. You know, there was this massive space, it was kind of a blank canvas, and what we would really want for the island of Jersey. And I know that she was extremely frustrated that the report they wrote and the time that they took into that, volunteering, those recommendations were not taken on board, and something else was decided instead for the waterfront. And we now have a hodgepodge, or I think somebody mentioned earlier, dog's dinner, of different things that are going on there. And I don't think I think we need to bring it back to what the island wants, what Jersey wants, and it comes back to that idea of the story that Deputy Renouf was talking about. And so I'm going to be supporting this proposition because it's about when we were during the elections, and what we have in the common strategic policy as well of the government is we want to be providing affordable housings and affordable homes for islands of Jersey, and we have that space there. There is a big space that is still to be developed. That blank canvas isn't quite filled up yet, and it's really important, I think, that we show the island of Jersey that we are hearing them when they're saying the young people, but also those who want to have right sizing, that we say yes, we're hearing you, and we can do this by helping provide on public land those kind of homes and that kind of community space that you were asking for. And we can go back a little bit to that time when there was that complete blank canvas, when we asked those islanders right at the beginning what we really wanted and what they wanted in this piece of land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? No other member wishes to speak? And I close the debate and call upon Deputy Miles to respond.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to all the members that have spoken in this debate. I don't want this summing up speech to go on for too long. It's very hot in here. So I will just pull out a few comments. First of all, from Deputy Wall, who is clearly interested and passionate about this subject. One of the questions he asked me was about why the 50% figure. A very good question. The aim has to be to build as much housing as possible which can be accessed by first-time buyers with or without an assisted purchase product. The previous propositions have all ranged 50%, 30%, 50%. I did point out in my report that 50% would be a challenge, and did invite amendments from members if they felt differently. I completely accept it's not an exact science, but I am heartened that the Housing Minister has agreed to deliver on the 50% set out, which is very positive, also with that flexible combination of products in between. He made some really valid comments about, lots of comments made about the waterfront by people who don't live at the waterfront, which was why I reached out to residents, I engaged with residents, and I have listened to what they've said, and as I said in my opening speech, I have changed some of the language that I have used around the waterfront accordingly. I've also suggested that a couple of those residents should set themselves up as the poster boys and girls for the States of Jersey Development Company for future developments, because they're very clearly enthusiastic and passionate about what can be achieved there. Deputy Waugh also mentioned the economic impact assessment, which has helpfully been provided in the assessment and which I've read carefully. A lot of that economic impact assessment says things that might happen. And we've had a lot happen over the last 5 years that we weren't expecting, COVID, Brexit example. So the economic impact statement is a view on what might happen. And it also talks about developers seeking to maximise their own profits. And I think we have to take that into consideration, particularly when we look at the 44.4 million that was raised in the final speech by Deputy Andrews. Deputy Ward also talked about vacant homes, and yes, of course, if we had a magic wand and we could fill all the vacant homes across the island, we would have a far reduced necessity to be building homes at all, but that is not the subject of this proposition. I'm glad that Deputy Tadier used the word exciting, because I actually think that is exciting. I think we have some hope here, certainly from the speeches that I'm picking up across the Assembly, that people are genuinely enthusiastic and genuinely can do about what has historically proved to be quite a tricky issue. I particularly liked his area about the rent-to-buy scheme, and I hope that the Housing Minister and the Treasury Minister will consider that as part of the overall assisted purchase scheme. Deputy Scott talked about the residents of St Brelard and empirical data. Well, I don't have empirical data, I haven't gone round with my clipboard, but I did knock on nearly every door in the parish, and a lot of people in housing estates, people my age, empty nesters, widows, said, yes, we would love to stay in St Brelard and we'd like an alternative. We've had 2 alternative sites in St Brelard over the last few years, one at either end of Route Orange, and both of those sites, which would have been very suitable for downsized housing. Little villages like Table Park have unfortunately, according to the planning processes, gone through for large luxury developments. But again, that is not the subject of this proposition. I was really pleased to hear Deputy Curtis talk technically about some of the issues on the waterfront and some of the issues across the island. And the issue of density is a really, really interesting one, because lots of people say, I don't want to go and live in a rabbit hutch. You know, the look and feel of what's down there already is very high density. And there is also the issue of some of the density. I know they're minimum standards, but some of the density standards across St Helier. And what I really want is for this debate to empower the Treasury Minister and the Housing Minister to be able to challenge some of the policies that are in place, which impede the development of appropriate and suitable housing, particularly around the southwest of St Helier framework. We have got an opportunity to create sustainable communities, something that was picked up by Deputy Stevenson. And I was happy that the Housing Minister was able to clarify about this very strange policy of only being able to buy housing according to the existing size of your family, or not a family at all, when you know you might want to move forward and have a family. There does need to be flexibility of criteria, and I think the Housing Minister has addressed that. In Jersey, the property ladder is very short. You might want to call it a step ladder or even a step. When my parents bought our home on States loan, there was no suggestion that they might be moving somewhere else in 5 or 10 years. It was the home that they would raise their family in, and I think the same can be said for a lot of the States loan purchasers. So I think we do need to get away from this criteria of having, I'll have a 1-bedroom flat and then a 3-bedroom house. Moving in Jersey is fiendishly expensive. The issue of the public realm, again, I know it's an area of concern for the Treasury Minister. I was very pleased that Deputy Stevenson mentioned Fort Regent. You know, it's a bit of a white elephant, isn't it? We've got significant opportunities there for public realm. And what is the expectation there? How are the waterfront public realm areas and Fort Regent public realm areas going to complement each other? How do we understand that in the round? I agree wholeheartedly with the Housing Minister. Our children do need hope, and they need confidence that they have a future. I'm really pleased to hear that the Housing Minister can deliver based on a package of measures. and that he is envisaging a range of products that will help young people to get onto the policy ladder. Again, Deputy Renouf, always lyrical speeches. There's a really long story about the Waterfront, and there's something published that was written, I think, in 2017 about the history of that by a local architect. There has been a lack of a compelling story, but we have an opportunity to piece back together those shattered dreams and broken promises, as the Deputy refers to. I agree that obviously this proposition doesn't solve every problem, but it is an important step, and it has to work for islanders. It has to work for Jersey. We're not Cape Town, we're not Dubai, we're not Paris, we're not Canary Wharf. We're a small island, and we need to find an island solution for an island problem that affects islanders. And I think that the site represents our opportunity to send that message. A great deal of time and money has already been spent on an unpopular waterfront scheme that many people, including numerous experts, had predicted would not achieve positive outcomes for islanders or even achieve planning permission. If we're to change the outcome next time, I believe we've got to change the brief to which the SOJDC are working. All of what we've heard today needs to be on the table. We need a community-led development and an agreement that there is an intent to deliver a scheme that delivers different housing, less height, less density, fewer rabbit hutches, more suitable right-sizing products, one that I would want to buy. So this government seems to have the appetite to grip the waterfront development once and for all, grip it firmly, and provide clear direction to the States of Jersey Development Company. This proposition is an opportunity for all States members to show our support for that shared ambition. I ask for the appel, sir.
The appel is called for. I invite members to return to their seats. I ask Greffier to open the voting and members to vote. If members have had the opportunity of casting their vote, I ask the Greffier to close the voting. The proposition has been adopted. 44 votes pour, no votes contre, no abstentions. Deputy Andrews, do you...
Yes, I would just like to announce that I am withdrawing my strategic reserve proposition, sir.
Very well. The Deputy has announced he's withdrawing the next proposition, which he is entitled to do, and that concludes the business of the Assembly. So I would invite the Chair the Chair of PPC to propose the arrangements for future business.
Thank you, sir. There have been no additional lodgings since the consolidated order paper was published, and there are a number of items down for debate at the July the 16th meeting. So I would expect that the meeting will last for at least the Tuesday and the Wednesday. Members should note that in light of the public holiday, which we agreed yesterday, the deadline for oral questions for the next meeting has been brought forward to Wednesday the 10th of July. The States Gref will send out a calendar reminder for the deadline for oral questions. Sir, I make the proposition for the arrangement of business.
Any members have any comment or observations? We can take that as accepted. Very well, thank you very much, Chair. That is the arrangement for future business. Accordingly, that concludes the business of the Assembly, and the Assembly stands adjourned until the 15th of July for the King's visit.